Hello, welcome to my back this week to my COVID office dungeon office, home office during the time of COVID in the basement, sparsely furnished, etc. So anyway, I just been filming from this very Spartan location and thought I would make reference to why. But welcome back. This week we are continue on our exposition of the Shorter Catechism, and we're going to be looking at question number 8 this week, which has to do with the way that God carries out His decrees. Last week we talked about what are the decrees of God, and we talked about the scriptural basis for that, the philosophical questions that are surround that. And this week we're going to talk about how he brings those decrees to pass. So this week we have question number 8. How does God execute his decrees? And really what we have here is a transition question that will lead up or set up the next 4 or 5 questions. And so the Catechism often does this, where it says what is X, and it'll be 2 different things. Well, here we have 2 things. The way that God brings about his decrees is through the work of creation and the work of providence. And then we're going to have 2 questions that have to do with the doctrine of creation, and then 2 questions that have to do with the work of providence, and the Catechism then flows into the theology of salvation. So today we basically are talking about, it's a relatively short video today because we're just talking about the division between creation and providence and the way that God brings about his decrees. So just to break this down for a second, there are some views of God, and there's a popular analysis of the American religious situation, which is called moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is the actual religion of most people in the West. It is a moralistic religion where people have to be good, and if you're good, you'll be rewarded. It's therapeutic in that God exists to make me feel better, to meet my needs, but really doesn't involve a strong relationship with God. So it's therapeutic. It's the cosmic Santa Claus. God is there for my, to help me. He's like a buddy. But moralistic and therapeutic. And then the last one is deism. And deism is basically that God is out there. He sort of created everything and set it up, and doesn't really intervene. And so it doesn't really have an impact on my life. I don't have to really do anything for him. It's just God is there to serve as my heavenly genie or Santa Claus. He's there to kind of give me a moral sense of what I should do and be, and that's about it. He set things up and kind of doesn't really run things actively. Well, that couldn't be farther from the way that the Bible presents God. And here we have that there are 2 ways in which he brings about his decrees or his plans. Is that he started it in the work of creation, but he continues it in the work of providence. Providence is that continual working out of his really governing, his sustaining. So what I want to do is look at a couple of scriptures which bear this out, how God both created all things and he also upholds all things, and that's the way that he brings about his plans in the world. So here is a scripture, and this is from the book of Colossians, Paul's letter to the Colossians. And this text relates to the fact it's discussing the preeminence of Jesus as opposed to the angels. And Paul is presenting an argument. It's really a Christological argument about the preeminence of Christ. But if we look at this passage, we see that Jesus and God, God through Jesus, both created everything and sustains everything. So this is what Paul writes. He is the image of the invisible God. That's Jesus. The image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created. Everything was created. In heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authority, all things were created through him and for him. Not only did he create them, but they exist for his own glory. That was the very first question of the Catechism, for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So this is mostly about creation, but it also involves providence, the fact that all things hold together. But you read this passage, and there's no question that the source of everything, whether visible or invisible, and Paul makes a list, the source of everything is God. That Jesus, the Son of God, had created, that he spoke into existence the entire universe. And not only that, but the scriptures are also very clear that this also involves every creature that exists today. And Psalms and other places, we looked at a psalm that talked about how he knit me together in my mother's womb. He knew me before I ever existed, and so forth. It's not only the creation at the beginning of time, but the continual creation of all things. And so this little passage mostly is about creation and how God created everything, but also it mentions that all things hold together through him. And here in the book of Hebrews, we have a very similar expression that is a little more detailed on the providence side. But let's take a look at this. This is the very beginning, opening statement in the book of Hebrews. It says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. So Paul, well, again, I sort of belie my opinion. I think that Paul wrote Hebrews, so sometimes I slip that in. The author here of Hebrews, he is writing to Hebrews, and he is arguing that they should not leave the Christian faith for going back to Judaism. And so he's making the case here that Christ, throughout the whole book, that Christ is the fulfillment of Old Testament Judaism and Old Testament prophecy. So here he begins. Long ago, many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. So there's the argument. Jesus is the fulfillment of the word spoken to the prophets of the Old Testament. And this is what he says about the Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. That's all things, everything. Not just religious things, not just souls, but everything. Souls, bodies, powers, dominions, everything. He is the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. So it's the exact same thing that Paul writes in Colossians. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. Very similar to what is written in Colossians. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Here is a more explicit statement about the providence of God. Not only the creation of God, which Paul briefly touches on his providence when it says all things hold together in him. But here it is more explicit. He writes that he upholds the universe by the word of his power, which is the same thing that created the universe, the word of his power, speaking into existence everything that would exist and that existed, that came to pass. And here we find that he not only created all things, but he upholds the universe by the word of his power. He is continually upholding, continually governing. And this is the word providence that the confession uses, is God's governing and preserving, and his active work in preserving and governing the world. And so we don't have a God who just sits back and waits. We don't have a God who sits on the sidelines. Paul makes it very clear in both these passages that God is active, not only in creating, but preserving and governing all the creatures and all their actions. He upholds the universe by the word of his power, and after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. He is at the right hand of the Father. This is repeated several times in Scripture. It refers to the fact that Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth. And so he not only upholds the universe by the word of his power, he has all authority sitting at the right hand of God. The risen and ascended Lord, who created all things, is the Son of God, pre-incarnate, eternal Son of God. Created all things by the word of his power, and he sustains all things as the Son of God, now incarnate in Jesus Christ, who sits at the right hand of the Father Almighty. And so this highlights the fact that there are works of creation and that there are works of providence. And here's the last, well, there's not a last verse. It's a catechism, the children's catechism. And so with this knowledge, it's much more simply put here in question 15, can God do all things? And the answer is yes. All things, summed up in the two branches, creation and providence. Yes, he does all things. Not only created, but he sustains everything by his holy will. And so we have a little bit of a shorter one today, but it's good to set up the next few series of questions, which have to do with the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of providence. We'll see you next time.